Okay, everybody, welcome back to part number 2 in the Gospels in HD. Now, last night we focused our attention on the Gospel of Mark, and you might ask the question, why is it that we started with Mark since Matthew is the first book of the New Testament? And that is the reason for this is because most scholars would agree that Mark was the first gospel written and Matthew and Luke and the other gospels came after that. And so last night, if you missed it, don't worry because you will be able to go back and watch that. I cut out some of the parts and some of the fluff so that you can watch it and go directly into that gospel, okay? But also, we also did an overview of the gospels, a background to the gospels, so that you have an understanding of why do we have 4 gospels? How were the gospels written? And how are they each unique from one another? And we talked about all of that yesterday. So we're not going to waste your time. We are going to jump right into the training tonight. We're going to study the Gospel of Matthew. All right, so we're going to jump in and we're going to look at the Gospel of Matthew. Here we go. So first and foremost, each day that we do this, we're going to complete this chart for you. And if we can review just a little bit, we said that yesterday Mark was Peter's scribe. And we said that Mark more than likely wrote Peter's account of the gospel. More than likely, what we see in Mark is Peter's gospel, but it's called the Gospel of Mark. And Peter, as you can see, was more than likely the earliest of the 4 gospels that were written. And Mark paints this picture of Jesus being a suffering servant. And you remember yesterday that essentially Mark was painting this picture to the Romans because he knew that Romans were very, very impressed with an action and power rather than a whole bunch of words and discourse. So Mark, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, he decided to strip away a whole bunch of the talking, the genealogy of Jesus, the birth narratives, and all these things that he knew that a Roman mind would not necessarily be impressed with. He knew that Romans would be more impressed with a man of action and power and could do supernatural things. So that's the reason why whenever we go and look at Mark's gospel, the literary theme or the dominating theme in Mark's gospel is doing miracles, because Mark wanted to convey the idea that this Jesus is the Son of God, and he did that mostly by focusing not so much on what Jesus said, but what Jesus did, right? And his goal was to prove that Jesus was the Son of God. And we said that about 7% of Mark was unique to Mark. The other 93% of Mark is also found in the other Gospels. Now, tonight, we're going to focus on Matthew, and tomorrow at 11 a.m., it's a different time, so it's not going to be in the evening, but 11 a.m. Central Standard Time. I know that's a quick turnaround. We're going to come back, and we're going to focus on my favorite of all 4 of the Gospels, which is Luke. It was a hard one because I love all 4 of them, but you'll see why tomorrow, why I really love Luke. All right, now let's focus on Matthew. Matthew was a hated tax collector. We'll talk about why tax collectors were hated in just a moment. We see that Matthew was written probably between 75 and 90 AD. And as we're going to see tonight, Matthew's main focus, you got to get this. If you don't get this, then it's going to be hard for you to understand the book of Matthew. The main focus, all right, is he wants to prove that this Jesus Christ was indeed the Messiah that the Old Testament had promised, prophesied, and predicted. That Jesus is the King of the Jews. So this is the picture that Matthew has got to paint for his primarily Jewish audience, that Jesus was the promised Messiah. And so 42% of Matthew is unique to Matthew. It's only found in Matthew, and it's not found in the other Gospels. Now, yesterday we went over this a little bit, but we're going to just briefly touch on it today. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic, syn means with or together. Optics, eyes, to see. So when you put those 2 words together, it means to see together, right? And so we group Matthew, Mark, and Luke together because we see them as being kind of together, right? They have similar content in them. They're arranged in a similar order in terms of its structure. John is completely different and unique from the other three. And so these are the synoptic gospels. And the idea is that if Mark was the first gospel written, then scholars believe that Matthew and Luke borrowed much of what they have in their gospel from Mark's gospel, right? So they borrowed quite a bit from Mark's gospel. But there is some information in Matthew and Luke that is not in Mark's gospel. So the question becomes, where did they get that information? Where did Matthew and Luke get that information? And scholars believe that there is some unknown hypothetical document called Q, which is short for Quelle, which is the word for source in the German language. And in this hypothetical document, there were parables, miracle stories, healings, sermons, signs, wonders, sayings, events, and all sorts of potpourri stuff about the life of Jesus Christ that each gospel writer basically, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, took a parable here, took a healing here, took a sermon here, took a saying here, took a story here, and used that information in a different way to try to convince their specific audience that Jesus was who they wanted them to believe. Okay? Now, all of that is background. Let's jump into Matthew. Now, who was Matthew? All right? We know who Mark was, but who was Matthew? All right? Now, Matthew, he was a hated tax collector. He was a hated tax collector who was one of the 12 apostles. All right? And he was hated because he swindled his own Jewish people by collecting taxes for the Roman government. And he wrote his gospel while living in Palestine. Now, we're going to talk about that, okay? Why were tax collectors so hated? And the reason why I'm going through this is because whenever you see tax collectors for the rest of your life, I want you to get a picture in your mind as to why the Jewish people hated these tax collectors so much. Now, the first reason is because, let's be honest, nobody likes to pay taxes, right? Especially to their oppressors. So you have to understand that during this time, the Roman government was heavily oppressing the Jewish people, which is why they thought that Jesus, right? They thought that when Jesus was going to come, when the Messiah was going to come, that he was going to be a strong king and he was going to free the Jewish people from the Roman oppression. This is the reason why many of the Jews rejected Jesus Christ, because he did not come in a way that they had expected him to come. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but essentially the big error is that the Jews, even to this day, they confused the first coming of Jesus Christ and the yet second coming of Jesus Christ. See, if you look at the Old Testament prophecies, many of the prophecies of the Old Testament are prophesying about the second coming of Jesus Christ and him being a king and being a ruler. Well, Jesus came as a carpenter and as a docile lamb, right? And so they were like, this can't be the Messiah. This can't be the king, right? And as a result, they missed it, right? So they were being oppressed. Another reason why tax collectors were hated, because these tax collectors were working for the Roman government and they were seen as traitors, right? They were seen as traitors. Now, I want you to imagine this for just a second. Let's just say it's 9/11, a little bit after 9/11, and I am working for the Islamic government. And I live here in the States, but everybody knows that I work for the Islamic government and I am collecting taxes for the Islamic government. And people know that I'm working for the enemy, right? That would be a reason why people may not like me, because they see me as being a traitor. How could you work for them when they are the very people that are oppressing us, right? And so these tax collectors were hated for that reason. And they often cheated people by collecting more taxes than what was owed, right? So not only that, right? Let's just say you owed $1,000 in taxes. Well, guess how I made my money as a tax collector? I would charge you about $1,300 in taxes and you couldn't say anything or do anything about it because I've got the Roman government behind me, protecting me. And so therefore, yeah, I'll take your $1,000 and I'll give that $1,000 to the Roman government so your taxes can be taken care of. And I'll keep the other 300 for myself. And that's how I made the money. And everybody knew this was what's going on. Everybody knew that's how tax collectors made it. And they cheated people and swindled people out of their money. Hold that thought until later on in Matthew. We're going to come back and you'll see why I'm asking you to hold that thought. Okay? But not only that, these tax collectors were considered well-to-do or wealthy or upper class, thus separating themselves from the common class of men. So for this reason and others, tax collectors were hated. All right? They were hated. Now, let's keep going and let's look at why Matthew wrote his gospel. All right? Now, Matthew, as I said, you have to get this. You have to get this. Matthew's purpose was to clearly prove that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah who the King of the Jews, or who is the King of the Jews that the Old Testament prophesied. That's it. That was his mission. Because he was speaking to primarily a Jewish audience, he said, how do I get into the mind of a Jew? How do I convince these stubborn, stiff-necked Jewish people who crucified Jesus that the very Jesus that they just crucified indeed was God, the King of the Jews? So let's just see exactly how he went about doing that, okay? So this is the basic structure of Matthew. The basic structure is that there's a prologue, first 3 chapters or so. That includes the genealogy, the nativity of Christ, Jesus and his family fleeing to Egypt, John the Baptist, and Jesus' baptism. Now, on the back end of Matthew, there's a climax or an epilogue. And this includes the basic things like the plot to kill Jesus, Jesus is betrayed, Peter denies Jesus, Jesus is crucified, and then Jesus is resurrected. Now, in between these two things are sandwiched 5 sets of teachings, okay? And each set includes some narratives or some stories followed by a discourse or a sermon or a lengthy teaching. And then you have another narrative and a lengthy teaching, and then a third set of narratives and a lengthy teaching, and the fourth set of narratives and a lengthy set of teaching, and then the fifth set of narratives and a lengthy discourse or sermon or teaching. And this is the structure of Matthew. So you can see here that the focus, right, of Matthew is sermons, is teachings. The focus of Mark was miracles. As we're going to see tomorrow, the focus of Luke was primarily parables. We'll get to that tomorrow, okay? I want you to make sure you come back. All right, here we go. So how does Matthew accomplish this? How does he accomplish this? Oh, it's going to get fun. Here we go. Here we go. Let's start with the genealogy. All right, just like we did yesterday. Now, you will remember yesterday, Mark's genealogy was just Jesus was the Son of God. He did not go into all of the names. Why? Because he knew that Romans could care less about any of the names of the Jewish people. They didn't know any of those people. But Matthew knew that his audience was well acquainted with these names. So I want you to notice how he does it. Matthew's genealogy says this: an account of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now I want you to catch that. Matthew ties Jesus' lineage back to 2 of the greatest figures in Israel's history, the son of David and Abraham. So I want you to think about the 3 greatest leaders in Israel's history. You have Abraham, okay? You have Moses, and you have David. These are the 3 greatest figures, the greatest leaders in the history of Israel. And so what Matthew is going to do is Matthew is going to try to prove and show how Jesus is the fulfillment of. He supersedes. He is greater than all 3 of these great leaders in Israel's history. He is the promised Messiah who supersedes all of their greatest leaders in the past. How's he going to do that? Let's start here. Matthew first had to prove that Jesus was a Jewish man, right? And therefore needed to trace Jesus' lineage first back to Abraham to prove that he had the legal right to be their king. You see what I'm saying? So he first had to say, well, you know what? If I'm going to prove that Jesus is indeed king of the Jews, I have to prove that he is a Jewish person, right? And how do we do that? We have to show the lineage to make sure that we can see that Jesus indeed is a descendant of Abraham. And so that's the first thing that he does. Now, the reason why this is important is because Matthew proves that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant from Genesis 12, who would bring blessing to the nations. I know you're like, well, hold on, Brother Allen, you're going too deep. Let me explain that. In Genesis 12:3, there's something called the Abrahamic covenant. Now, this is just a covenant or a promise that God made with a man named Abraham. What was this promise? This promise is that I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And notice, all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, I want you to notice this. It doesn't say all the Jewish people. It doesn't say all of the, it doesn't say all, no, it says through you, Abraham, all of the nations on the earth will be blessed. You see, so Matthew is painting this picture that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. The idea that through Jesus' ministry, he is going to bring salvation to all the nations of the earth and not just the Israelites. All right, let's keep going. Now, that takes care of Abraham. But what about David? Now, next, Matthew had to prove that Jesus was related to David as the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant from 2 Samuel 7. You say, Brother Allen, you're going too deep. What is all these covenants? Well, let's look at it. In 2 Samuel 7, God made a covenant with another man named David, and basically the promise that God made to David was this. He says, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. So this is the promise that God gave David. And he said, David, I'm just going to make a covenant with you. As long as there is a king on the throne of Israel, they will always be a descendant of yours. And this king will have a kingdom or a throne that will be established forever. So if Jesus is going to be a king that has a throne or a kingdom that is established forever, then Matthew had to make sure that he traced Jesus' lineage back to David so that he could prove that Jesus indeed had the right to have a kingdom that would be established forever. Everything is intentional, you see? Okay, now let's go back. As a matter of fact, several times in the Gospel of Matthew, we see people referring to Jesus as the Son of David. They knew that the Son of David was a messianic term, right? So whenever they called Jesus the Son of David, they understood what they were saying. They were saying that you are the king, you are the Messiah. Notice, as Jesus went on from there, two blind men followed him, calling out, have mercy on us, Son of David. So they understood that this man was the fulfillment of the prophecy of David. Then a demon-possessed man who was blind and unable to speak was brought to him. He healed him, and so that the man could both speak and see. All the crowds were astonished and said, could this be the Son of David? Do you see what I'm saying? Like there was this idea that could this be the Messiah? Could this be the king that would be able to have a throne that lasts forever? And so they were asking that, right? Okay, now that takes care of David. But what about this middle character, Moses? Here we go. How was Jesus a fulfillment or how was Jesus a type of Moses? Well, if you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, there was a promise that there was going to come a prophet like Moses one day. And it says here, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses, from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will tell them everything I command him. I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name, right? So do you see here that the Israelites understood that there was some sort of coming prophet like Moses, but they didn't know who it was. Matthew is going to prove that this prophet that you've been anticipating to come like Moses is indeed Jesus. And let me show you exactly how he does it. Okay, notice the rest of it. But the prophet who presumes to speak a message in my name that I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet must die. Okay, let me show you this beautiful symmetry between Moses and Jesus. Watch this. This passage says that I will raise up for them a prophet like you, Moses. Well, guess what? Jesus was very similar to Moses in his ministry, which I'll show you on the next slide. Notice that Jesus said, well, I know you've heard that Moses has said this, but now I say this. Okay, now it also says, I will put my words in this prophet's mouth. Well, what did Jesus say in John? He said this, and I quote, for I have not spoken on my own, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a command to say everything I have said. Sounds like Jesus is a fulfillment of Moses. And then it says, I will hold accountable whoever does not listen to my words that he speaks in my name. Well, notice it says here, truly I tell you, anyone who hears my word, Jesus says, and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not come under judgment, but has passed from death to life. That's interesting, right? So Jesus says, hey, if you do not listen to my words, you will be held accountable. Now, let's also look at some other parallels between Moses and Jesus. Now, I'm going somewhere with all of this, all right? All right, it's raining pretty hard out here, so you could probably hear that in the background. Moses, Pharaoh tried to kill at birth. Notice that Herod also tried to kill Jesus at birth. Moses came out of Egypt. Matthew 2 says Jesus came out of Egypt. Moses went through and passed through the waters of the Red Sea. Jesus passed through the waters of baptism in the Jordan River. Moses was in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days. Moses receives an old law from a mountain. Jesus delivers a new law on the mountain, which we're going to see tonight. Moses delivered the people from slavery. Jesus delivers people today from spiritual slavery. Moses had 5 books called the Torah or the Pentateuch. Jesus had 5 major teachings that we're going to look at here in the Gospel of Matthew. Moses established the old covenant. Jesus established the new covenant. So we see all of these parallels, right? All of these parallels between Moses and Jesus. So in this, Matthew shows that Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's 3 greatest leaders. Okay, so let's jump into the content now. And this is where things get really fun. Okay, so in Matthew 4 through 7, we have this first section, right, where there are narratives and followed by an extensive teaching. All right, and these are called discourses or sermons. Now let's take a look at Matthew's structure. Once again, Matthew 4:7, we're going to call this part the revelation of the kingdom, where Jesus is revealing his kingdom. He's showing people, he's presenting his kingdom to the nation of Israel and ultimately to the world. All right, let's keep going. Now, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. This is critical. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, notice what it says here. 3 things that are accomplished in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus describes the people of his kingdom, right? So remember, he's presenting his kingdom. He's revealing this kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven to his people. And he says, these are the types of people that are going to be part of my kingdom. All right? And these are the principles that my kingdom will be governed by. And then he says, I'm going to show you the pathway into the kingdom. If you want to be part of my kingdom, here is the way in which you get in. Now, let's break all of that down and let's take a look and see how Jesus did this in the Sermon on the Mount. Who are the people in his kingdom? In this first section, Jesus is describing the types of people who will inherit this kingdom that he's building. This goes against the grain of what people would expect for a quote-unquote kingdom, right? And everything that Jesus is going to say is countercultural to what the people would have anticipated and expect. Notice this. Who are the people that Jesus describes in the Sermon on the Mount? Blessed are the poor in spirit. Wait, what? Poor people are going to be in the kingdom? No, that can't be. Humble people? No. Meek people? No. Those who hunger and thirst? No. Those who are pure in heart? Well, maybe. Peacemakers? Those who are persecuted. So every group of people that Jesus discusses and presents to them goes against the types of people that they would expect to be in the kingdom. So these are the people of the kingdom. Now that Jesus has described the types of people, he then moves to describing the principles of what scholars have called this upside down kingdom. This upside down kingdom is this kingdom that is totally opposite, totally different, totally out of the ordinary of what people would actually expect from a king. Now, what are the principles of the kingdom? Well, he positions Jesus as a greater teacher than Moses. I want you to notice this. Matthew is positioning Jesus as a greater teacher than Moses with statements like, well, you've heard that it was said. Implication, I know what Moses said, but now I come to tell you what it really meant. And notice it says here, don't think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Now, this brings into question, how did Jesus actually fulfill the law? I mean, what does that really mean? When Jesus says, I've come to fulfill the law, I mean, we read all this stuff, right? We read it as we're studying the Bible, but what does that actually mean? Well, let's take a look at that. Okay, Jesus fulfilled the law in the following ways. Number one, through his teachings. Jesus further explained the true essence of the law, as we're going to see in just a moment. So essentially, Jesus is like, you know what? I know that you think the law means this, but I'm now coming to you telling you this is what it really means. So your understanding of the law was incomplete. It might have even been incorrect. So now I have to come along and fulfill it. I have to come along and further explain to you what was behind the actual law. We'll get into that in just a second. But the second way that Jesus fulfilled the law was through prophecy. Jesus fulfilled every single prophecy that was written about him. So every time Jesus did something to fulfill a prophecy, he was fulfilling what the Old Testament had spoken about him. And the third way that he fulfilled the law was to demonstrate how to live perfectly according to the law, right? I mean, we know that it's impossible for us to obey the law and to fulfill the law. But Jesus came to show this is how you obey the law perfectly because I am a perfect man. All right, so let's keep going. Now, Jesus' goal here in this sermon, you have to catch this or you're going to miss the point of the Sermon on the Mount. His goal here is to transform the hearts of his people from mere external obedience to internal transformation. Now, let me explain that. Let's just take anger and murder, right? So Jesus is saying, you know what? I know that you've heard that murder, you should not murder. But I'm going to now take it a little bit further and explain to you what that really means. It really means that you shouldn't have any anger in your heart. What was Jesus doing? Jesus was now taking them from the place of external obedience only to where they could say at the end of the day, I'm a perfect person. Why? Because I have not murdered anyone. So therefore, I am perfect. But Jesus said, no, that's not what the law is all about. right? The idea is that even if you are angry with someone in your heart, you've already committed murder. What did this do? It forced them now to take a look at their own heart without being so quick at the end of the day and check off a box and say, you know what? I didn't murder anybody. I'm perfect with God. No. Now you have to think, did I have any angry thoughts, any unforgiveness, any hostility, any slander, any malice, any gossip, any ill will towards anybody? And now Jesus is saying this is a matter of the heart, right? Now, lust and adultery, same situation. It would be easy to say, you know what? I didn't sleep with another woman or another man today. Therefore, I'm perfect and no need to do anything or make any changes. But what if you lusted, right? Jesus says you have to look at your heart. And then also marriage and divorce. He talks about that, right? You can't just divorce somebody for any reason that you want to. Taking oaths. You don't have to go through all these things and take all these oaths. He said, no. Just check your heart and say, is your heart pure when you say yes to somebody? And is your heart pure when you say no to somebody? That should be enough. If you say yes or no, that should be enough. You shouldn't have to take an oath. Once again, getting to the heart of the issue. Going the extra mile, right? Loving your enemies. Say, what? I'm supposed to love people who are persecuting me? Yes, because this is the upside down kingdom. These are the principles by which my kingdom is going to run and be established. Giving, praying, and fasting. These are the principles of the kingdom. Relationship to money and possessions. See, in these days, it was all about trying to get more and have more money, and that's what people wanted, similar to today. But Jesus says, no. In my kingdom, you have to give it away. You cannot love money. You can't be so consumed and focused with money that money comes before your relationship with me. So everything is topsy-turvy. Everything is upside down. All right, let's keep going. Now, Jesus then ends this first sermon with laying down the pathway into the kingdom. Terry Washington, thank you so much for the super chat. I appreciate that. All right, so how do you get into the kingdom, right? And Jesus says this, it ain't easy. Matter of fact, he says, enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction. And there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and few find it. Notice he says, you know what? To get into my kingdom, it's not easy because it's a narrow road that you have to walk. So much so that he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. You see that Jesus is trying to shake them up. He's trying to shake them up to understand that his kingdom that he's getting ready to establish is a whole lot different than what they expected. So much so he says that many of you in this crowd right here are going to say to me, Lord, Lord, and Jesus says that's not going to be enough one day because you have not done the will of the Father. You've not had a heart transformation. Okay? And he also finishes this statement with this. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So Jesus is saying, hey, you have two options if you want to be in my kingdom, right? If you want to be in my kingdom, he says, hey, you got two options. You can build your house on rock or you can build your house on sand. And one of them is going to stand when the winds blow, like it's raining out here right now, right? One of them is going to stand and one of them's not. That's the pathway into the kingdom. Now, with that being said, let's just pause for a second before we go to this next section, and let's look at how Matthew used the Old Testament to prove that Jesus was the promised Messiah. You've got to get this. Understand this now. Matthew knew that his Jewish audience was well aware and well acquainted with the Old Testament prophecies. So what did Matthew do? Every chance he got, he referenced back to the Old Testament to show these Jewish people who were rebellious and stiff-necked, many of whom were probably supportive of Jesus being crucified. He references back to the Old Testament and says, hey, Do you not see this Jesus fulfilled all these things that the Old Testament has promised? That's why he's the Messiah. So let's look at it, okay? Let's look at some ways that Matthew used the Old Testament. Notice Mark didn't do this. John didn't do a whole lot of it. Now, there are 53 quotations from the Old Testament. And there are 76 references, not quotes, but references to Old Testament passages, totaling 129 references or allusions. Matthew refers to 25 of the 39 Old Testament books. Wow. Let's look at some of them. The virgin birth. When Jesus was born of a virgin, it says here, she will give birth to a son, and you are to name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins. Now, all of this took place, notice Matthew says, to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet. See, the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel, which is translated, God is with us. Remember that for later. So here we have Matthew reaching back to Isaiah 7:14 and saying that when you see Jesus being born of a virgin, he is fulfilling the prophecy from Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. Let's keep going. He stayed there until Herod's death, so that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. You see, so do you remember that Jesus' family, Jesus, Joseph, and Mary, they had to go to Egypt, right? They had to go to Egypt because Herod was trying to kill all of the babies, right? And so they had to flee to Egypt. Well, out of Egypt, then Jesus came, right? And so Matthew sees this as a fulfillment of prophecy. And now let's look at this. Because many of the children were being killed, right? Because many of them were being slaughtered, Matthew sees the weeping of the women in the Jewish community as yet another fulfillment of prophecy. Notice it says, then what was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be consoled because they are no more. So Matthew sees this, and he sees these women weeping because their children had just been slaughtered by Herod. And he says that's actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy, right? That's actually a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Even Jesus speaking in parables. Jesus told the crowds all these things in parables, and he did not tell them anything without a parable. Why? So that what was spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. I will open my mouth in parables. I will declare things kept secret from the foundation of the world. Okay, so Matthew uses Old Testament prophecy. Now let's move this thing along so we're not here all night. Okay, so Matthew 8 through 10, we're going to now call the rise of the kingdom. Matthew 4 through 7, Jesus reveals his kingdom. 8 through 10, we see the kingdom on the rise. Now, let's take a look at this, because in this section, Jesus shows how he is going to bring this coming kingdom that he's talking about from heaven to earth with 9 stories of hurting and broken people. Thank you, Ian. I appreciate that. Jesus is going to show in physical, tangible form how does my kingdom, how am I going to demonstrate my kingdom in actual real time? Well, notice this. There's 9 stories of Jesus healing. There's a story of Jesus heals a man with leprosy. Then Jesus heals a centurion's son. Then Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then Jesus calms the winds and the waves. Thank you, Pamela. And then Jesus drives out a demon from a man. Then Jesus heals a paralytic in chapter 9. Then Jesus heals a bleeding woman. Then Jesus heals 2 blind men. Then Jesus heals a man who was mute. And sandwiched in between these sets of 3 are these sections where Jesus challenges them. Now follow me. You've just seen me heal a man with leprosy. You've just seen me heal a centurion's son. You just saw me heal Peter's mother-in-law. Now come follow me. Come follow me based on what you've seen. Now, you just saw me calm the winds and the waves. You just saw me drive out a demon from a man. You just saw me heal a man who was paralytic who couldn't walk. So you know what? Come follow me. Come follow me. And he says all of these things in this next section. So now, after putting his power on display, he then delegates his authority to the disciples and sends them out to do the same thing. And this introduces the second sermon of 5 in Matthew. Do you remember the first one? Was the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 through 7. The second sermon or second discourse is a shorter one. And this is where Jesus gives his disciples specific instructions. Summoning his 12 disciples, he gave them authority over unclean spirits to drive them out and to heal every disease and sickness. Now let's move into the third section of Matthew 11 through 13. Oh my goodness, here we go. Now we're going to call this the response to the kingdom. You see, the first Matthew 4 through 7, Jesus was revealing his kingdom. And then in Matthew 8:10, the kingdom was rising. Jesus was healing and doing miracles. Now we see how people are responding to the kingdom that Jesus is trying to bring from heaven to earth. So in this section, Matthew highlights various responses to Jesus' kingdom message. Now, some are positive, right? Notice when Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he moved on from there to teach and preach in their towns. So these people received him, he preached, he taught. Some were positive, right? Now, some were just neutral. And they were like, wait, could this be the son of David? I'm not convinced yet, but I'm not sure it's not. So could it be the son of David? So they were confused. They were trying to figure out. And so they were neutral. And others were negative. You see, when the Pharisees heard this, they said, this man drives out demons only by Beelzebul, the ruler of the demons, right? So they were accusing Jesus of casting out demons by using satanic power, which doesn't make any sense. Why would Satan cast out Satan? That wouldn't make any sense. And Jesus basically says that. Now, Matthew now includes Jesus' response to their responses to his person and work. So remember, some are positive, some are neutral, some are negative. So what does Matthew do? He includes a chapter, Matthew 13, where he is going to highlight how Jesus is going to respond to their response to him. Let's look at it. There's a parable of the sower. We went over that yesterday in Mark. And then there's a parable of the wheat and the tares. There's a parable of the mustard seed. There's a parable of the hidden treasure. And then there's another parable of the net. Now, all of these represent his kingdom. They all represent his kingdom. And this is the third of 5 discourses. So do you see how it's happening? Right? This is the third of the 5 discourses. It's just a long section where Jesus is teaching about the kingdom. We call this the kingdom discourse. Let's look at one of these little parables. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a large net thrown into the sea. It collected every kind of fish. And when it was full, they dragged it ashore, sat down, and gathered the good fish into containers, but threw out the worthless ones, right? Threw out the worthless ones. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels will go out, separate the evil people from the righteous, and throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Do you see what Jesus is doing? Are you catching this, right? Jesus is talking to the people, some of whom are positive, some of whom are negative, some of whom are neutral. And he's saying the kingdom is going to be like a big old net filled with fish. And in this net, right? In this net, some are going to be good fish, some will be bad. And so we're going to keep the good fish and throw the bad fish out. He said that's how it's going to be later on in the judgment. Some of y'all are going to be good fish. We'll keep you. Some are bad. We're going to throw you out to a place where it's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Could you imagine how they were interpreting and understanding what Jesus was saying at this time? Now that leads us to the fourth section of the book, Matthew 14 through 20. The fourth section of the book. Now we're going to call this the retirement of the king. And I call it that because Jesus essentially is saying, you know what, I've done a lot of public ministry and a lot of public teaching. I'm going to retire to some degree and focus more of my time on preparing my disciples and a smaller group of my followers for what is about to actually happen. And so he retires to some degree. Okay, he retreats. He invests more intimate time with his apostles, teaching them about his overall mission and that he must suffer. Here we go. Now, what's interesting is in this section, Matthew once again tries to show that Jesus is a fulfillment or a type of Moses. You see, Matthew shows the parable of Jesus feeding the 5,000, which would include mostly Jewish people based on the region and where that miracle happened, with 5 loaves of bread. And then a little bit later on, a couple chapters later, he shows how Jesus fed another group of 4,000 people, mostly non-Jewish, based on the region and where he did that miracle. Well, if you look back in the wilderness, Moses was also feeding the people bread, manna from heaven, right? He was feeding the people through God, obviously, right? And so once again, I want you to see these deep parallels that Matthew is trying to subtly sneak in there to show that Jesus is indeed a greater Moses. Okay? Now, Jesus teaches his disciples, if anyone wants to follow after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Now, we looked at that yesterday when we looked at Mark's gospel. Now, similar to Mark, as we looked at yesterday, the disciples are still very confused about Jesus' mission. That makes sense because it's the same story. They're very confused about this. And for that reason, now Jesus launches into a fourth teaching. And this is the fourth discourse. We'll call this the discourse of the church. And he talks about things like humility, right? He says, hey, he calls a small child and had them stand among them. Truly, I tell you, he said, unless you turn and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So he says, you know what? You're very much like, you need to be much like a child, humility. But then he also says this. He says, the way you handle conflict in my kingdom. He says, if your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. He also teaches them things about forgiveness because he's trying to teach them the principles of his kingdom. And this new group of people called the church, how are we supposed to relate to one another? Humble, resolving conflict, and forgiving. He said, Lord, how many times do I have to forgive my brother and sister who sins against me? As many as 7 times? Jesus said, no, not 7, 70 times 7, right? And that's just one for one sin, right? So he is establishing the new order of this kingdom. That leads us to the fifth and final section of Matthew. The fifth and final section of Matthew. We're going to call this the rejection of the king. You see the progression. Matthew 4 through 7, the revelation of the king. Matthew 8 through 10, the rise of the kingdom, right? Matthew 11 through 13, the response to the king. Matthew 14 through 20, the retirement of the king. Matthew 21 through 27, the rejection of the king. And this is where Jesus experiences significant rejection. So Jesus presents himself as he comes into Jerusalem. The whole city was in an uproar saying, who is this? The crowds were saying, this is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee. And notice that Jesus straight up exercises authority by casting out and cleansing their temple. Notice what he does. It says here, Jesus went into the temple and threw out all those buying and selling. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the chairs of those selling doves. He said to them, "It is written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you all are making it a den of thieves." Do you know what these people were doing? They were taking advantage of the fact that people were coming into town for the Passover, and these people were not able to bring animals that they could make appropriate sacrifices for, right? Because it was a long journey for many people. So they couldn't bring a whole bunch of animals so that they would have enough animals to sacrifice while they were there. That means that while they were there in Jerusalem, they had to purchase animals to then make sacrifices. Well, these people at the temple, they were jacking up the prices so that they could get rich. It would be like you and I going to a movie theater and having to pay $5 for some Junior Mints. That's just wrong. When you can go to the dollar store and get that for $1, you are inflating the price. And Jesus says, no, you're not going to do that. Now, not only that, there were some money changers. The money changers basically were there to exchange different types of money or currency. Well, what they would do is instead of making it an even exchange, they would jack the price up. Once again, Jesus knew this was happening. He stormed into the temple and he said, I'm going to put an end to this. Y'all are not going to use my house for your own financial gain and purposes. Now let's get back. As a result of this, the religious leaders were like up in arms. They're like, who is this fool? Flipping over tables and who does he think he is? This is our temple, for God's sake, right? So when he entered the temple, the chief priests and elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority, Jesus? Why are you doing this? Who told you could come in here and do all this stuff? Now, I love this because they can't outsmart Jesus. Notice what he says. Jesus answered him, I will also ask you one question, and if you answer it for me, then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Did John's baptism come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Jesus said, before I answer your question, I want you to answer my question. Did John's baptism come from heaven, or was it of human origin? Well, they discussed it among themselves, and they said to themselves, well, man, if we say from heaven, he will say to us, then why didn't you believe in John? Why didn't you get baptized when John told you to get baptized? Why didn't, if you say it's from heaven, right? And then they said, but if we say of human origin, we're afraid of the crowd because everyone considers John to be a prophet. So they said, well, if we say John's repentance was from human, they say, well, man, that's not going to work because everybody in the crowd is going to be angry at us because everybody respected John to be a prophet. So they said, Jesus, we don't know. We don't know. You stumped us. And he said, well, neither do I know about the authority that I have, that I'm not going to tell you about these things that I'm doing, right? And Jesus straight up embarrasses these guys, and they are offended, so much so that they begin to plot to have Jesus killed. This then leads into the fifth and final sermon, teaching, or discourse. Remember, 5 books of Moses, 5 teachings or sermons of Jesus. Jesus calls these religious leaders hypocrites. He spoke to the crowds and to his disciples. The scribes and the Pharisees are seated in the chair of Moses. Therefore, do whatever they tell you and observe it, but don't do what they do because they don't practice what they preach. They're hypocrites. They don't practice what they teach. And as a result, Jesus is so distraught that he weeps over the city, his people. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Can you hear it in Jesus' voice? He's crying out, he's weeping because he's saying, I wanted you to believe in me. I wanted you to accept me. I wanted you to love me, but you just weren't willing. And he cries because he knows what is going to take place. And this is what he predicts. Jesus basically says this. Do you see all of these things? Liz, thank you so much. God bless you for that. Do you see all of these things? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. He says judgment is coming. This temple is going to be destroyed. And now he finishes this discourse. We're almost done, guys, by essentially saying, until I return, this is what I want you to do. I want you to stay alert. I want you to watch for my kingdom, and I want you to work for my kingdom. Notice he says things like, who then is the faithful servant who his master has put in charge of his household to give them food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom the master finds doing his job when he comes. He says, hey, if you just don't worry about when I'm coming back, just be diligent to be faithful, to work, and to do what I've called you to do. And he says, if you do, you'll be like that servant who is working when his master returns. He says, but I truly tell you, he who put him in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked servant says in his heart, well, my master, he won't be back for a long time. I can fool around and waste time. And he starts to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards. That servant's master will come on a day he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be a weeping and gnashing of teeth. You see that? And guys, that is a great application for you and I. If we have this mentality, you know what? I can do what I want to do because Jesus isn't coming back anytime soon. Jesus says, no, we should not have that mentality. We should be working and should always be staying alert because Jesus could return at any time. Okay? And he gives them these instructions. We don't need to read through this. This is the parable of the talents. Some had 5, others had 2, another had 1. They went on a journey, and as a result, the one that used the 5 and made 5 more was blessed. The one had 2 and used 2 more was blessed. But the one that said, well, I only have 1, I can't do anything with my gift. He said, hey, you know what? You're going to be separated to a place of utter darkness. Now, just like yesterday, we're not going to go through this much, but Jesus then explains how he is the fulfillment of the Passover by sharing a meal with them. If you want the details on that, go back and watch yesterday's series or video on Mark. All right. But essentially, Jesus is explaining to them, just like you observe the Passover, I am actually the fulfillment. I'm the Passover lamb. Now, I want you to notice a couple other things here. That Matthew references more Old Testament scripture here to further show Jesus' life and death was a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Thank you so much, Dennis. Notice here, it says here, then Jesus said to them, tonight, all of you disciples are going to fall away because of me. All of you all who think they're going to be with me, all of you are going to fall away, right? And Matthew sees that as a fulfillment of prophecy. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. So you see how Matthew is trying to show every chance he gets that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophet. Here's another one. Then what was spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. They took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him whose price was set by the Israelites, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. He sees Judas betraying Jesus as a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Now, this is the last thing we're going to look at tonight, and we'll be done, guys. Thank you for hanging with me. The concluding couple of verses in the Gospel of Matthew bring this entire gospel full circle. Notice what it says. Jesus came near and said to them, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Now watch this. Teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you, and remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Thank you, Michael, for that super chat. Appreciate that. Notice this. Even all the way to the end of the book, Matthew is going to show how Jesus is a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. Look what it says. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. How did Jesus fulfill that? He is the king or the son of David, right? Kings have all authority. So in this statement, he's showing how Jesus is a fulfillment of the son of David. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. What is the fulfillment? Watch this, Abraham. Why? Genesis chapter 12. The promise to Abraham was through Abraham, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Abrahamic covenant. Through Jesus and those disciples who follow after him, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Why? Because we're supposed to make disciples of all the nations. Teaching them to observe everything I have commanded you. You know who this is? This is fulfillment of Moses, who was Israel's greatest teacher, who taught them the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Now watch this. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. Here it is. Emmanuel. God with us. He says, you're not in this by yourself. You're not in this by yourself. He says, as you go about making disciples, teaching people to observe all that I've commanded you to do, he says, remember one thing. I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. God with us, Emmanuel. And my friends, that is the story. That is the gospel of Matthew.